Good evening and welcome. Our speaker this evening is an independent historian from New York. Jason Emerson has worked as a journalist and as a National Park Service ranger at the Lincoln Home National Historic Site and the Gettysburg National Military Park. Jason's talk, entitled Mary Todd Lincoln, Sane, Insane, or Simply Misunderstood, will present information about Mary Lincoln's mental health from childhood to death, her commitment to an insane asylum in 1875, her history and her legacy as America's most maligned First Lady. His talk is based on the two books he's written about the subject: The Dark Days of Abraham Lincoln's Widow, as revealed by her own letters, and The Madness of Mary Lincoln. And now, help me welcome Rock County Historical Society Executive Director Joel Van Haften, who will introduce Jason.
We always have this problem. Thanks. I'm so pleased to see all the people that have come out to see the presentation tonight. This kind of began as a little glimmer in my mind months ago when I applied for a grant through the Alliant Energy Foundation. And that grant was to help us basically bring Jason out from New York. And it's kind of hard to get speakers to come from New York out to Wisconsin, and he was pleased to do it. I just wanted to point out a few things. We obviously had this grant through the Alliant Energy Foundation, and we're so pleased to get it. So we wanted to thank them. And then obviously that was enough to cover some speaking fees for Jason. But I also want to point out that the Hedberg Public Library also, I think the Nancy Parker Fund and the Rock County Civil War Roundtable have also enabled us to bring him out here by paying for his travel expenses. And then obviously I'm picking up a lot of the lunch and dinner. And lunch and dinner. Yes. And Jason's staying at my house. And I got a bill for you.
Okay. I didn't bring my wallet.
Some people know this, but I used to work with Jason at Lincoln Home. And back when he had that little funny hat on, he didn't bring it this time. So, but he'd walk around, he'd talk to the public, and I would sit in the carriage house and take care of all the little things that were at Lincoln Home. And I remember one day that I walked outside, and I can't remember if it was you or another park ranger, but somebody came up to me and said, "What's in there? What's in the carriage house?" And
that was me.
That was you? That was you?
Me.
And they looked at me and they said, "Well, what's back there?" And I had to explain it. Well, it was the carriage house. Well, did they keep the car in there?
Well, that was not me.
And I immediately thought, the Lincoln Town Car, obviously. And I'm done. I won't say any more puns. But I'm pleased to have Jason here. He's got a wealth of knowledge about Lincoln lore, and I think you'll be pleased to listen to what he has to say. Jason, come on up.
Thank you all so much for coming. Can you all hear me all right through the microphone? All right. Can always count on Joel to tell an embarrassing story. That wasn't me. Well, it's so nice to have such a great crowd. You never know, as a historian, when you're going to talk, if people will actually show up or not. So, now, in October 1927, Mary Harlan Lincoln, the widow of Robert Todd Lincoln, the oldest son of the Civil War president, received a surprise visitor at her Manchester, Vermont home. The caller was a woman named Myra Pritchard, who was the granddaughter of Myra Bradwell, who was an icon of female and legal activism and one of Mary Todd Lincoln's close friends during the 1860s and throughout the 1870s. Now, this visit was in fact a courtesy call by Mrs. Pritchard to inform Mrs. Lincoln that of the impending publication of her book, The The Dark Days of Abraham Lincoln's Widow, as revealed by her own letters. Now, this was a history of Mary Todd Lincoln's commitment to the insane asylum in 1875, and was based on a collection of more than 30 letters between Mary Lincoln and Myra Bradwell, most of which dated to Mary Todd Lincoln's time inside Bellevue Place Sanitarium in Batavia, Illinois. None of these had ever been published at that time. Now, Mrs. Lincoln was a gracious hostess. She thanked Mrs. Pritchard for the visits, for the information, for giving her a copy of the manuscript, and she also asked Mrs. Pritchard if maybe the two of them could meet up next spring in Washington, D.C., where Mrs. Pritchard lived, and so that they could talk about the book after Mrs. Lincoln had read the book, and maybe Mrs. Lincoln said maybe she could help her with her manuscript, with some insights from the Lincoln family, maybe even documents from the Lincoln family. And so Mrs. Pritchard left Manchester very gratified and very excited by her visit. Now, by this time, in 1927, despite the glut of books about Abraham Lincoln, there never had been a book solely written about Mary Todd Lincoln. She was a mere side character in her husband's heroic story, and practically nothing had ever been written about her 1875 insanity trial and institutionalization. Now, some of Mary's earliest biographers actually lamented this paucity of written materials about her. Honoré Wilcie Morrow wrote in 1928, "It is an astounding thing to contemplate the fact that Lincoln could grow to such godlike proportions he has attained in people's minds, and yet so little be said about his wife." A few years later, Dr. W.A. Evans, he encountered the same roadblock, and in his book, which is actually back on the table, he wrote, "One day I went to the library and asked the attendant to fetch me everything she could find dealing with Mrs. Lincoln. When the material came back, it dealt principally with Mr. Lincoln. There was very little about his wife. I turned it back over to her and I said, 'I'm not looking on material for Mr. Lincoln, I'm looking for material on his wife,' to which the attendant asked why he would want to do such a thing." Now, in fact, this was one reason why Myra Pritchard had written her book. She knew the subject would be not just a historical, but also a publishing boon. And as her attorney later said, she was very desirous of becoming a well-known author. And in fact, as a 12-year-old girl, she published a book of poetry. But Mrs. Pritchard had a second reason for writing this book. It was actually her mother's dying wish. Her mother, Bessie Bradwell Elmer, had always believed that Mary Todd Lincoln was not insane, that she had been unfairly imprisoned by her son, Robert Todd Lincoln, in the insane asylum. Bessie believed that the letters in the Bradwell family's possession would vindicate Mary Lincoln against the charges of insanity, and they would prove that Robert Lincoln had acted badly, if not maliciously, in having his mother committed. Now, exactly how Mary Harlan Lincoln felt after Myra Pritchard's visit is unknown. But what is known is that after she read the manuscript, she decided that she did not like it. And so when her attorney, Freddy Towers, met Mrs. Pritchard in Washington, Mrs. Lincoln could not go, she was sick, Mr. Towers let it be known that Mrs. Lincoln objected to the idea of the book being published as it was. He said, all the letters were printed in the book, and he said there were 3 letters specifically that Mrs. Lincoln felt were unfair and objectionable to print. Now, when Mrs. Pritchard refused to edit these or any other items out of the manuscript, Mrs. Lincoln very cordially, very graciously, she was a very quintessential genteel Victorian woman, and so she very, very graciously threatened to sue her. And so in the end, since Mrs. Pritchard would not change the manuscript, but she did not want to be sued, there was a law that had been, or a court case that had occurred very close to that, that said the writer of the letter and all of his or her descendants owned the letters, not the recipient. And so in the end, Mary Harlan Lincoln bought the letters, she bought the unpublished manuscript, and she bought out the publishing contract that Myra Pritchard had acquired for $22,500. But why would Mary Harlan Lincoln do this? One reason was that even as this was going on, Robert Lincoln's cousin, Catherine Helm, was in the middle of writing the family-authorized biography of Mary Todd Lincoln, which was published shortly thereafter. And Robert and his wife had been assisting Mrs. Helm with her book for a number of years, giving her letters and documents and family stories. And actually, a lot of those that are in her book cannot be found anyplace else anymore, including some of the documents. And so, of course, to help Mrs. Pritchard would have hurt Mrs. Helm's project. But there was a much deeper reason than that. Mary Harlan Lincoln knew that for about 50 years, from 1876 until Robert's death in 1926, Robert had actively sought to suppress anything written about his mother's insanity case and what he called her period of mental derangement. And in fact, for a few years, he attempted to collect and destroy any letters that he found during this period. Now, he did this out of a Victorian sense of family privacy and propriety, but he also felt that his mother's behavior was an embarrassment to the family, to herself, especially to her husband's legacy, but also to Robert personally. And Mary Harlan Lincoln agreed with her husband. And after his death, she continued this tradition of suppressing any Mary Todd Lincoln letters she could find. And so, finding herself with no options, Myra Pritchard, in the spring of 1928, sold all the materials and all copies, vacated the publishing contract. But of course, she was not happy about it. She was, in fact, quite devastated and really infuriated by Mrs. Lincoln's actions. All of her work had basically been for nothing. And she had no idea what Mrs. Lincoln intended to do with the letters, but she assumed that they would all be destroyed. And perhaps this was why she actually illegally kept copies of every letter and the manuscript. Now, in 2005, after a very long search, I discovered a steamer trunk that was once owned by Freddy Towers, Robert Lincoln's personal attorney. He had been his attorney for many, many years. Now, inside this trunk were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Lincoln family documents that nobody had ever seen before. Also in the trunk were Mary's missing letters and Myra Pritchard's unpublished manuscript. And the full story of how I found that, which I'm not going to talk about right now, but I'll be happy to address it during questions. But the full story is in my book, The Madness of Mary Lincoln, as well. But it was based on these documents that I wrote my book, The Madness of Mary Lincoln. And this is my historical interpretation, my research on Mary from childhood to death, and why she was committed and what was her mental state and why Robert did exactly what he did. Now, my latest book, this is Myra Pritchard's unpublished manuscript, The Dark Days of Abraham Lincoln's Widow, as revealed by her own letters, that my publisher graciously allowed me to edit and annotate. So, what was Mary Harlan Lincoln exactly trying to hide from the world when she burned all these letters? What did they say? Was Mary Lincoln really crazy? Now, it may not surprise anyone to know Mrs. Pritchard said no, Mary was not crazy. I say I think Mary Lincoln had very, very serious mental illness. But what is the evidence? Because in the end, that's what history comes down to, is the provable evidence. Well, just like the difference between myself and Mrs. Pritchard, today there really are still two different opinions of Mary Lincoln's mental health. The currently prominent theory was popularized by Jean Baker in her 1987 book, Mary Todd Lincoln, A Biography. Now, that book was a feminist, revisionist psychobiography, labeled by others than me, although I completely agree with the label. And in that book, Mary Lincoln was a perfectly sane woman, a saint, really. And everything bad that ever went wrong in her life was the fault of someone else, typically a man, usually Robert Lincoln, her son. And Mary was the victim of a male chauvinist society and a cold-hearted, rapacious bastard of a son who was trying to steal her money. Now, the other theory, which is much less prominent, which is in my book, of course, and also another book from 1986 called The Insanity File, The Case of Mary Todd Lincoln, by Mark E. Neely and R. Gerald McMurtry. And in that book, that argument basically is that Mary Lincoln was insane, and that her son Robert did what he felt was both necessary and proper in order to protect her from herself as well as from other people. Now, what's interesting is that all of us, but especially those two books, which were written in 86, 87, all at the same time, but we all use the exact same evidence. Robert Todd Lincoln's personal insanity file. He kept a complete record of his mother's institutionalization. And And that was discovered in his house up in Vermont in the 1970s. And yet, despite the fact that we all, but particularly those two books from the 80s, use the exact same evidence, they came up with completely antithetical conclusions about what happened and why, leading one historian to wonder whether evidence even matters anymore in matters of historical importance, which I think is an astute observation. But I believe that evidence does matter. And I think that the evidence shows quite clearly that Mary Lincoln was a very sick woman. Looking at her early life, one can very easily discern early manifestations of manic depressive illness, or what today we call bipolar disorder. She had symptoms of depression, delusions, hallucinations, narcissism, paranoia, insomnia, extravagant mood swings. Of course, her most famous symptoms was her excessive buying of clothing and materials, which is a form of monomania. Now, these early manifestations later developed into full-blown psychotic episodes, with those symptoms usually magnified. And they eventually devolved into threats of physical violence against other people, specifically her son Robert, who at one point she said she had hired 2 men to murder him. And she also for a while carried a gun in her dress and said, "If you ever show your face to me again, I will kill you." And Mary also did attempt suicide in 1875. Now, the multiplicity of all these psychotic episodes shows that this was a lifelong thing for Mary. And it was not simply from one episode in 1875 from which her son precipitously decided to just have her committed, which a lot of people think. But actually, this was a lifelong series of events, and it was also part of Todd family history. I found 14 members of the Todd family that had mental illness as well. But of course, Mary Lincoln lived a life full of trauma and tragedy, and this also must be taken into account when trying to consider her mentality. She suffered the early deaths of both of her parents, the deaths of 3 of her 4 children, of course, the murder of her husband as she was sitting next to him, actually holding his hand. She suffered the deaths of numerous relatives during the Civil War. She alienated almost all of her family and friends during the war because of her own bad conduct as First Lady. She suffered the relentless criticism of the press, the apathy of the American people once she left the White House, and the disdain of Congress, who refused to give her a pension that she not only felt she was entitled to, but that she needed in order to survive. And if you look at these major traumatic events in her life, these are when the psychotic episodes usually triggered. And, for example, in a span of 6 months, from 1849 to 1850, Mary's grandmother, her father, and her 4-year-old son, Eddie, all died. And Mary was, of course, distraught. She wouldn't eat, she wouldn't leave her room, she wouldn't change her clothes, and finally her husband had to plead with her and say, "Mary, you must eat, for we must live." Of course, the Lincolns then had 2 more sons, Willie and Tad, and she got much better. But then in 1862, 11-year-old son Willie Lincoln died of typhoid fever in the White House. And once again, Mary Lincoln was inconsolable. She wouldn't eat, she wouldn't change her clothes, she wouldn't leave her room. And finally, her husband one day took her to the window of the White House and pointed across the river to the insane asylum that could be seen on top of the hill. And he said, "Mother, do you see that building over there? Try and control your grief or it will drive you mad, and we will have to send you there." And I think it's interesting that for all of the opprobrium heaped upon Robert Lincoln for having his mother committed, it is in fact Abraham Lincoln who was the first person on record to suggest that she may need to be committed. Now, of course, after Willie died, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. And then 6 years later, in 1871, Mary's youngest son, Tad Lincoln, died of pleurisy when he was about 17 years old. Now, many people, including Robert Lincoln, believed that Mary Lincoln's mental troubles began because of the assassination. A few people thought that it was Tad's death in 1871 that really triggered it. I personally think that it was Tad's death that pushed her over the edge. I mean, if you look at Mary's life, Abraham Lincoln really was her anchor to sanity. He was her perfect mate, and I think they loved each other, and I think they had a good marriage. A lot of my colleagues in the Lincoln field disagree with me, but I think they loved each other very much. But he was the perfect man for her. He knew exactly how to treat her. He knew when to laugh with her, when to cry with her, when to make fun of her, when to yell at her, when to just pick up the kids and leave the house. In 1869, she actually wrote in a letter, she said, "Mr. Lincoln was from my 18th year always, husband, brother, father, lover, all to me, truly my all." And when he died, Mary Lincoln immediately clung onto Tad, her youngest son. And for the next 6 years, actually, she barely let the poor kid out of her sight. Then when Tad died in 1871, Mary had nobody left. She had alienated all of her family and friends because of the way she treated people as First Lady. And her oldest son, Robert, he was a grown man. He was married, he had children, he had a thriving law practice in Chicago, and he could not give her the attention that she wanted, and that in many cases she needed. And to be honest, he was kind of exasperated dealing with her all the time, which I can understand as a son. So after Tad's death, Mary basically became a homeless wanderer, roaming around America, going to various health spas or spiritualist retreats. In 1873, she began fairly constant medical treatment by Dr. Willis Danforth for what he termed fever and nervous derangement of the head. And if you've read anything about Mary, you may have heard some of her symptoms. She told the doctor, which he testified at the trial, that an Indian spirit was pulling the wires out of her eye and pulling the bones out of her jaw. He kept removing and replacing her scalp. She thought that rebels were following her, trying to murder her. She saw danger in inanimate objects, usually a window in her room. She heard voices in the wall. She heard voices in the floor. She would sit and listen to these voices. She would sit and talk to these voices. She would ask other people if they heard the voices. One big symptom that all the other books about Mary, they all conspicuously leave out, is that Mary had this horrible fear and delusion about fire. She was in Chicago in 1871 during the Great Fire. She was never in any danger. Robert Lincoln's house was in the south of the city, so she was there, but she wasn't running through the streets trying to find the lake to save herself, but she was there. But after that, she was terrified of fire, and she always thought constantly that buildings or entire cities were either on fire or were about to be on fire. And so in 1875, Robert Lincoln, when he couldn't deny his mother's condition anymore, he consulted 7 of the best medical experts in the Midwest, as well as 3 of his father's closest friends. But those 7 medical experts all told him the same thing. They said any person, man or woman, with a delusion about fire such as that, could at any minute leap out of a window, thinking that the building they're in is on fire. Now to me, that's reason enough to have your mother committed, just so she doesn't kill herself in a fit of delusion or hallucination. Now by 1875, Mary was wintering in Florida. She had a personal nurse with her that Robert had hired in 1872. And Mary, while she was in Florida, she was suddenly gripped with this intense delusion that Robert, her last surviving child, was dying. And nothing anybody said or did could convince her otherwise. And so she hopped on the first train, she went to Chicago, and of course Robert was fine. So she stayed in Chicago, she stayed at a hotel because she and Robert's wife did not get along, and so she could not stay at her son's house. And over the next few months, Mary's condition deteriorated very rapidly. So this was when Robert consulted the doctors, he consulted his father's best friends, and everyone said, yes, she's crazy, including all of Mary's relatives in Springfield, Illinois. They all said this, yes, she's crazy, she's been crazy for a long time. And so the only way that Robert could get her treatment was if she went voluntarily, which Mary Lincoln would never do, or under the Illinois law, he had to have her arrested, brought to court, and tried for insanity. The trial lasted 3 hours. There were 18 witnesses, including Robert Lincoln, and the jury took less than 10 minutes to declare her insane. And Mary was sent to Batavia, Illinois, to Bellevue Place Sanitarium, which was a private institution that Robert had arranged for her. Now, Mary was supposed to be in Bellevue Place for a minimum of 1 year, but she was actually released after 4 months and sent to live with her sister Elizabeth and brother-in-law Ninian Edwards in Springfield, Illinois. Now, this abrupt change was the result of Mary Lincoln. After about 2 months in the asylum, she thought that she was perfectly sane and that she had been imprisoned against her will and that her son Robert was trying to steal her money. And so she hatched a plot to secure her freedom. And she enlisted the help of her old friends Myra and James Bradwell, who were both lawyers. And through them, she launched not just a private, but a very public campaign for her freedom. Now, by September 1875, after only 4 months at Bellevue Place, Mary was allowed to leave. Neither her doctor, Dr. Patterson, nor her son Robert believed that she was sane. But Mary was so agitated about her situation that they both knew that no good could come of keeping her there. So they considered it an experiment to let her go to Springfield and see how she behaved. So she spent the next 12 months in the Edwards home. And during this time, Robert was his mother's court-appointed conservator, and he controlled all of her money and her assets. And as time passed, Mary's mental condition, according to her sister and her brother-in-law, it improved greatly. They said, she is better than we have seen her in many, many years. But on the subject of her finances, she was worse. She was just infuriated that Robert controlled her money. And she grew more and more embittered at him every day. And as I said, she even threatened to kill him at one point. And Robert gave his mother everything she asked for. She kept writing him letters saying, give me my paintings, give me my books, give me my clothing. All of this stuff was stored at his house because she didn't have a house. And so he sent her everything. But he could not return to her control of her money because by law, he just could not do that. So Mary became so intractable and so angry that she began to revert to her pre-sanitarium ways. And at one point, Robert even threatened to send her back to the sanitarium. He told his uncle, he said, my mother has always been very generous to me, and I am very grateful for everything she's done. But being grateful is not enough. I will do my duty to her as her son as best I can, even if necessary, against her will. But Robert did not send her back. He was legally bound for 1 year to be her conservator. And when that year expired in June 1876, Robert agreed to return control of her estate back to his mother. Now, Mary's second trial declared her restored to reason and a fit person to control her own property. Actually, the trial was never meant to declare her sane. It was only meant to give her her property back. The law clerk wrote restored to reason on the paper. No one was more angry about that than Mary Lincoln, because to her, that's giving her back a sanity that she had never conceded she lost. So she was infuriated by that verdict. But so after the trial, Robert went down to Springfield, gave his mother back control of her property, and she did not speak to him again for 5 years. She was so angry. She went into a self-imposed exile in Europe. Now, these are the basics of Mary's insanity story. And for decades, historians have wondered, what more is there to the story? Everybody knew about the Bradwell-Lincoln correspondence, what has come to be called Mary's lost insanity letters, but nobody could find them. Dr. W.A. Evans, in his book in the 1930s, he said there's nothing left of these letters except for the tradition. In the 1950s, Ruth Painter Randall, who wrote a biography of Mary, she simply said that the letters had vanished. In the 1970s, Justin and Linda Turner, who compiled Mary's collected life and letters into a book, they decided that Robert Lincoln must have destroyed these letters because they were so damning to him and to his reputation. But as I said, Myra Bradwell had all these letters, and even after she sold them to to Mary Lincoln, she kept copies of everything. And Mary Harlan Lincoln's attorney, Freddy Towers, he also kept copies of everything. And these are what I found in the steamer trunk in his attic. We do not know exactly if Mary Harlan Lincoln had knowledge that Frederick Towers kept these letters, or if he did it secretly behind her back. I actually think he did it secretly because of his son told me that his father had seen the Lincolns burned papers and he disagreed with it. So I think he actually kept it. So basically, what do these letters say? Everybody's trying to find them. What do they say? And basically what I say at this point in my talk is all of these letters are printed in my book. It is a very lovely book. There are some for sale over on the table. No, I'm just kidding. Of course I'll tell you what they say. The letters are fascinating. I found 25 letters. 20 were written by Mary. 5 were written by other people about Mary. Most of them were written when she was in the asylum. And they show her physical health, her mental health. They illuminate some missing pieces of where she traveled, who she was with, what she was doing. What I think is perhaps the most interesting letter was the very first letter she ever wrote when she was inside the asylum. As I said, Mary Lincoln orchestrated her own release from the asylum. But for decades, everybody said the story was Myra Bradwell got Mary out of the asylum. And Mary, she was kind of this passive character sitting in the corner while her activist friend got this done. But what this letter and all the others show is that Mary Lincoln got herself out. And Myra Bradwell merely helped her, however willing and able she may have been. Now there are some letters, some people have told me they find the most interesting. There's one from August 1875 that after Mary had been in the sanitarium for 2 months, you can see she's getting increasingly frustrated at being where she was. And she wrote to her friend Myra Bradwell, she said, "It does not appear that God is good to have placed me here. I endeavor to read my Bible and offer up my petitions 3 times a day, but my afflicted heart fails me, and my voice often falters in prayer. I have worshipped my son, and no unpleasant word ever passed between us. Yet I cannot understand why I should have been brought out here." But some people think the most interesting letters are the ones Mary wrote after the asylum, after she left for Europe for 4 years. Practically nothing is known about that time, except for some of these letters I found. And in these letters, they talk about where Mary Lincoln was, who she was with, what she was doing, how she was feeling. They're very interesting because not only do they show part of her life that we don't know about, but they're also very rational and very cogent and actually very sane letters, which has led many people to say, well, see, that just proves that she was never crazy, that Robert railroaded her into that asylum. It was a kangaroo court. He bribed the judge and jury just so he could steal her money. What I think it shows is that Mary's time in the sanitarium actually helped her. But also being in Europe, she was away from all of the stressors of her life. She was away from the relentless press. She was away from people criticizing her. She was away from Congress and dealing with them trying to get a pension from her. But as she also wrote in one letter, she said, "I am given peace here, and I am not harassed by a demon." The demon, of course, being her son, Robert Lincoln. Now, Mary Lincoln and her son Robert did actually reconcile in 1871, 5 years after they stopped talking. And they were on good terms until Mary's death in 1882. And in fact, Robert visited his mother about every week until she died. Now, I think it's interesting that Robert Lincoln, who I've just recently finished writing his biography, it'll be out next year, I don't think he ever could have conceived to what degree of a mustache-twirling villain he has come to be recognized at nowadays. Especially because at the time of Mary's insanity trial in 1875, the nearly universal reaction to the knowledge that Abraham Lincoln's wife was declared insane was, yeah, that figures. I'm surprised she didn't go crazy a lot sooner. And everybody just completely, they sympathized with her. How could she not go crazy? I don't blame her. And almost everybody, every newspaper, diary entry, everything I've read said Robert Lincoln had a very hard duty to do and he did it well. And I can't imagine how I would act in that same situation. And yet, it's ironic that, as I said, the current prevalent conception of Robert is that he was a rapacious, horrible man who hated his mother so much, he was so embarrassed by her, he shut her away and he was trying to steal her money. And of course, as I said, that is not what happened at all. And yet this difference between this contemporary assessment of Mary and of Robert and the opinions of later historians as to what did or did not happen, they could not be more antithetical, which I find interesting. And yet this vast gulf between perception and understanding still persists even today. And I think that this is the fault of not presenting all the evidence. I think that when people actually look at all the evidence of Mary's case and what Robert did and why, and I think and I hope that I have presented all of that in both of these two books here, I think only then can we truly understand what happened to Mary Lincoln and why. Thank you very much. I would love to take questions. And I'm going to guess the first question is going to be, how did I find the letters? But go ahead. Okay.
Yeah. I think I ask this question as someone who's read a few books, seen a few movies, but I appreciate your historical insight.
Mm-hmm.
We're all captured by the times in which we live.
Mm-hmm.
And Mary Talman was known to be an extremely intelligent
Yes, no, the comment, the question was, Mary Lincoln was an incredibly intelligent, politically active, astute woman, and it must have been frustrating for her in the context of her time when women were not supposed to be intelligent and politically active and astute, that she could not express her opinion. She would have to do so through her husband or through her son or her father or whatnot. Yes and no. I mean, Mary Lincoln had 14 years of schooling. She had more education than most men did at the time. But, you know, and it's interesting if you look at different interpretations of Mary, but Mary Lincoln was first and foremost, to herself, a wife and a mother. She was always fascinated by politics, but she was not, you know, a lot of people think, especially in the 90s, this came out a lot, that Mary Lincoln was kind of like Hillary Clinton 100 years too early, that Mary should have run for the Senate. Mary was really the power behind the throne. She gave her husband valuable political advice. That is absolutely not true at all. Mary, as she said, and even Mr. Lincoln said, Mary, she knew people. She was a very good judge of people. Where Mr. Lincoln saw only the good, Mary Lincoln saw the truth. And so she often gave him advice about people. And even in one of her letters, she said, I never gave Mr. Lincoln political advice, ever. And even if I did, he wouldn't have listened anyways. But Mary Lincoln, you know, she was, I don't think she was frustrated with her life until she got to the White House. And that wasn't so much about politics as it was about her social position. She just could not win. Basically, when the Lincolns got to Washington, Washington's society, they all hated Mary Lincoln. The Northerners thought she was a traitor because she was born in Kentucky. The Southerners thought she was a traitor because her husband was the president. All the Easterners thought she was an uncouth Western rube because she was from Illinois. And all the Washington social elites, they just didn't like her because she was an outsider. And basically, you know, during the war, if Mary held a big ball, as the First Lady is supposed to do, she would be criticized. How dare you do that when the soldiers don't even have blankets? So then she would skip the next ball that she's supposed to have. And how dare you not have a ball? That is your job as the First Lady. So she just could not win. And one historian actually wrote, which I agree with, he said that if there had never been a war, if Mr. Lincoln had just had a normal one-term, you know, non-exciting presidency, Mary Lincoln today would probably be considered the greatest First Lady we've ever had. And I agree. She was intelligent, she was witty, she was cultured, she was urbane, she knew how to dance, she knew how to dress, she knew how to decorate, she knew how to entertain, she knew how to have a conversation. She was a perfect First Lady. But she could not handle the war. She could not handle all of the criticism of her and of her husband and of her children, and she just couldn't handle it. And so I think that's the real frustration, is that she tried to do her best as First Lady, and her best was never good enough. But yeah, politics she didn't really get into that much, except for appointments. Yes, sir?
You mentioned the word pleurisy, I don't know what that is.
Pleurisy is basically a buildup of fluid in the lungs, and it, you know, chokes you, but also constricts the heart. And so it's an incredibly painful, long, suffering way to die. And in the end, Tad, he had to sleep sitting up in a chair with a metal bar across it so he wouldn't fall down. And that, otherwise he would drown in his own fluids. So yeah, he basically, they think that he got sick. They were in Europe and they came home, and he got sick on the steamship journey over, and then he died. Which is even worse because Mary, she did not want to come home at the time, because in her letter she says, I am terrified that my little Taddy will not survive the trip. And she was right. And how awful, because she blamed herself. Yes, sir?
When Lincoln was killed, what was Mary Lincoln's wealth? How much money did she have?
When Lincoln was killed, what was Mary's wealth? Good question. Well, her wealth was zero. I mean, it was Mr. Lincoln's wealth. His estate was about $85,000. David Davis, the estate executor, when he finished probating it, it was over $100,000. And that was divided into thirds between Mary, Robert, and Tad, the three heirs. But almost all of that was in land and property and bonds. So basically, Mary and the boys lived off of the interest, the yearly interest on all of those investments, which for Mary was about $1,500 a year. And that was a, you know, respectable middle class income. But for Mary Lincoln, that was utter poverty. Part of that was she had a delusion that she was always in poverty. That was part of her mental illness. But also Mary, as the First Lady, she thought she was a queen. She expected to be treated like a queen, which is why she alienated many people. She was called the Republican Queen by a lot of people. But also, she expected that after her husband was dead, that the American public and the U.S. Congress should pay for her to live the rest of her life as a queen, which they didn't do. And so for her, $1,500 a year, which was more than most people had, was utter poverty. But, you know, all of these funds started being raised for Mrs. Lincoln's benefit. But then when the newspapers came out and said Abraham Lincoln's estate is $100,000, everybody took their money back. And nobody wanted to give her anything, except she had a lot of debts, and one big wealthy financier gave her, I think, $10,000 to pay some of her New York City clothing debts, actually. Yes?
I get the impression that during the insanity and during that the 4 months that she was in the asylum, that her and Myra Pritchard were very, very close.
Mm-hmm.
But after she gets out and moves on and starts traveling, her letters seem to taper off to Myra and things of that nature. Did their friendship kind of dissolve after basically Mary kind of used her, so to speak, to get out? And just kind of said, oh, well, I'm done using you, so bye-bye now, thanks so much.
That's an interesting question. As far as I can tell, well, the last letter between them was 1878, and Mary died in 1882. However, Myra Pritchard says in her book here that she actually had more letters that she did not put in her book, and they were also not in the trunk that I found. And in the book she says, oh, they are just personal chatty letters that I think would be impinging on her privacy to put in the book. Which I think, well, you put all the other ones in there. So that's infuriating for me. So they may have gone up, but I know that the Bradwells did not attend Mary's funeral, which they were only in Chicago. I think they would have. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. If anybody used anybody, I think the Bradwells used Mary, because what's interesting to me is that they came out there, they created this huge public media frenzy. Mary got released from the asylum, and then the Bradwells did not speak to her again for 8 months. And so one of my theories is that maybe Robert Lincoln told his mother, you can leave if you don't speak to the Bradwells, and they don't speak to you. And this is possible because the day after Mary's second trial, Myra Bradwell wrote her a letter. But we don't know. And a lot of people at the time, a lot of letters to the editor of newspapers, some editorials even, said the Bradwells are merely intermeddling busybodies who care nothing about Mrs. Lincoln but only about themselves and their own publicity. And they published a newsletter called the Chicago Legal News, and they just wanted to increase their circulation. So, but as far as I can tell, I think they were probably friends all the way till Mary's death. But Mary Lincoln did give them, besides these letters, she gave them numerous relics from her husband, Abraham Lincoln, that actually are now in Springfield, Illinois, in the Presidential Library. Yes?
So how did you find the trunk, and what did you do?
I didn't think anybody was going to ask. How did I find the trunk? Well, as I said, it's in this beautiful book. I was doing research on Robert Lincoln, my biography of Robert, at his house, Hildene, which is in Manchester, Vermont. And it is a private historic site, and if anybody ever gets out that way, I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful place. And so I was there. It was March, I think it was 2005, 2003 that I was there. And I'll never forget it. It was a very cold, overcast, rainy, horrible Vermont March day. And the curator took me up to the house, and at that time it was closed for tours. The lights were off, the heat was off. So he took me up and he set me up at Robert Lincoln's dining room table, his original table. And there were no lights, but the whole wall was just patio glass doors. So that was my light. I'm sitting there and there's like all this china around me, and there's a portrait of Robert Lincoln mounted in the wall, just staring down at me. And my friend the curator gave me a very cold and uncomfortable folding metal chair to sit on, which I have still not fully forgiven him for. So we walked through Robert's library, we walked into the back office, into Mr. Towers' office. And Robert had installed one entire wall, was like, oak or mahogany, some ungodly expensive wood. And it was all archival shelving and boxes and drawers and things. And so the curator gave me a pair of the white curatorial gloves, and he said, hey, listen, I forgot, I've got a meeting. So I'll see you later. And he left. He left me all alone. And he's lucky I'm an honest person, because I had my bag with me. And I could so easily just, So I put on the gloves, I pulled down the first box, just covered with inches of dust, no fingerprints. I don't think anybody had pulled those boxes down probably since Robert had died in the 1920s. And so I took it back to the table, and as I'm looking through this box, I found a letter from Mr. Towers to Catherine Helm. And it said, "Dear Mrs. Helm, we had a surprise visitor today. And Mrs. Myra Pritchard came and said she has these letters." And so I knew, that's about Mary's lost insanity letters, which everybody's trying to find and nobody can find them. So, I got excited. So I started digging really fast, and I went through all the papers, and I found another one from Mr. Towers to Mrs. Pritchard. And this one said, "Mrs. Lincoln would like to meet you in Washington, and maybe she can help you with your book." So then, of course, I scoured the house, 25 rooms. I went up in the attic, went down in the basement. I would have dug through the coal if they had let me, but they didn't. And I didn't find anything else. So I copied those letters and I brought them home. And I've been to every Lincoln archive in America, so I thought, well, maybe I can track down any Bradwell descendants. So I found Myra Pritchard's last living relative. He lives in Michigan. And he had a folder full of legal documents. And those legal documents showed that Mary Harlan Lincoln threatened to sue her, and it was all about the sale of these letters and everything. And so he gave me copies of all that, but he didn't have the letters. But once I knew it was a legal matter, then I thought, well, I'll try to track down the Towers family, because they were Robert's attorney. He was Robert's attorney for 20 or 30 years. So after many months of archival searching, Google searching, cold telephone calls to complete strangers who probably thought I was crazy, I found Freddy Towers, the son of Frederick Towers. And I said, "I'm writing a biography of Robert Lincoln." He said, "Oh, Daddy loved Robert Lincoln. I remember riding in the Pullman car with Mrs. Lincoln, and I remember visiting Hildene." And yeah, we had a nice chat for 10 minutes or so. And so I just opened my mouth. I'll never forget this. I opened my mouth to say, "Well, the reason I'm calling is," and he said, "You know what? We just found Daddy's old steamer trunk up in the attic. And it's full of letters Mary Lincoln wrote when she was in an insane asylum. Do you think those are worth anything?" I said, "That's why I'm calling you." So it turns out the steamer trunk, there's a picture of it in the book. It's like this big, As I said, hundreds, maybe thousands of Lincoln family documents. Mostly Robert Lincoln, but some Mary and Abraham. One letter from Mary's father, Robert Todd. All the letters, the manuscript, plus the Lincoln family side of all the legal documentation of the sale of the letters. So then I had the whole story right there. It's every historian's dream, find a trunk in an attic full of missing letters.
Where were you? Where in
What's
the
that?
United States? Where did Freddie live?
That was in Silver Spring, Maryland. But actually, I saw the letters, it was in New York City, which is, Freddie had two sisters, and his older sister had the trunk in New York City. So I went to her house, and she let me just I took like a hunk of about 200 pieces of paper, and I just walked outside and went to Kinko's and photocopied everything. She didn't even mind. But what's really interesting is that they did not know the trunk was in their attic. It had been up there for almost 50 years. And the only reason they found it was because they were moving. And they actually only found the trunk 7 days before I found them. So if I had called them 8 days sooner, they would have said, "Oh, sorry, we don't have anything." So those letters are now, they donated those to the Library of Congress. So actually, funny story, I was in the manuscript room recently. I had to redo all my citations for this book, because for this book it was just Towers papers. And then this book, it was Library of Congress. So I had to get all the accession numbers and whatnot. So I was sitting at the table looking through these letters, and there was this guy sitting next to me, and I said, "Hey, I found these." And he didn't believe me. I said, "No, really, I did." He said, "All right." So he did. Okay, so, but I know I did. Yes, ma'am.
I trust you have read the transcript of the trial. Did you
Yes.
put it in the trial?
Well, there's no transcript, but the newspaper reports, yes.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
They're very detailed newspaper reports.
Very
those.
unfortunate.
Yeah.
I was wondering what was the criterion to commit her, to declare her insane?
Well, what was the criteria to declare her insane? As I said, the Illinois law said she had to have a trial. Before that law, that was the most liberal mental health law in America. Before that law, and in other states at that time, all that was required was a man to call her crazy. And that was it.
Therefore, I firmly believe that had Mary Lincoln been alive today, by our standards, she would never, ever have been committed. Certainly not in the state of Wisconsin. The only criterion for commitment, and I used to be a social worker, and I'm
Okay.
aware of this, for commitment to a mental institute in the state of Wisconsin is is the person a danger to themselves or others?
Mhm.
And if they're not either, there is no evidence for any type of commitment proceedings.
Well, when I wrote The Madness of Mary Lincoln, I consulted with psychiatric experts because I'm not a doctor. And I feel like if you're going to try to understand someone's mentality, you should talk to the experts. And actually, my main expert, Dr. Jim Bruss, wrote an essay of his professional clinical opinion of Mary based on my historical evidence, and that's in one of the appendices here. And what he and other experts told me was that today, if Mary Lincoln were alive today, she would be committed for maybe a week or two, just for observation. She would be given medication, and she'd be fine, which is very sad. And actually, Dr. Bruss told me, which I found very interesting, he said, of course he didn't give me specifics, but he told me that he had a patient, almost the exact same thing. That was a woman, a widow, same age. She had one son. Her son had her committed for the same reason, hallucinations, delusions. I think he had her for 3 or 4 weeks. He put her on medication, and she was fine. And she told him, she said right to his face, she said, "Thank you so much. This has helped me, I can't even tell you." And yet, she never forgave her son for having her committed, even though she admitted that it helped her, which is how Mary was, which all the experts, none of them found that surprising at all, that she was so angry at Robert. Yes, ma'am, way in the back there. Yes.
I've done some reading on this though, and she was given 1 hour of notice before the trial. Her son appointed her attorney, she didn't have her own attorney, and she was not allowed to speak on her own behalf. And several of the doctors had never met her, that testified against her.
Yes and no. The Mary Lincoln, she was given 1 hour's notice before she was taken to trial. Actually, under the law, she was not required to have any notice. So it was about 3 hours because Leonard Swett had to talk her down for 2 hours to get her to come to the courthouse. Which actually, he could have just called the cops and they could have slapped the cuffs on her and arrested her. And actually, that's what Robert was going to do. He was just going to follow the law. And Swett said, no, I'll go talk to her. And Robert later said, thank God you did that because that would have been a huge mistake if I had let them arrest her. So at the courtroom, Leonard Swett and B.F. Iyer, one of the biggest attorneys in Chicago, they represented Robert. And under the law, Mary was not entitled to an attorney. But they got Isaac Arnold, who was a congressman during the war, one of Abraham Lincoln's good friends. They got him to act as her attorney. And at first he said, no, I don't want to do it because I think she's crazy. And I think she needs help, and it's not fair. And Leonard Swett, who by that time he was really frazzled, he said, then you're going to get it in her head that she can get some high-powered lawyer and make trouble for us. Go do your duty. Which that has been taken in a very negative connotation. But basically Arnold, a lot of people say that she had no defense, that Arnold never did anything, and that Mary never said a word. And that's what the Chicago Tribune newspaper reports say. But there's actually about 6 Chicago newspapers that reported on the trial. And all the other newspapers show that Isaac Arnold actually put up a fairly good defense. He rebutted, he recalled witnesses, including Robert, and that Mary actually did speak during the trial, apparently. Some people say she did, some people say she didn't. She could have taken the stand, but she apparently chose not to. But, and then on the jury, under the law, there had to be at least one doctor. But Mary's jury was composed of the most eminent and respectable men in all of Chicago. And that was not an accident. The judge, M.R.M. Wallace, he knew this was Abraham Lincoln's widow. And if this trial was not perfect, that everybody, him, Robert Lincoln, everybody would be censured horribly for what they had done. So, and actually one of the trial jurors, later he gave an interview all about the trial. This actually hasn't really been published anywhere in any books. And he told one Lincoln scholar, he said, at the trial, he said, there was so much evidence that proved that she was ill. There was no way we could not find her guilty. And in fact, Robert Lincoln only gave Leonard Swett the bare minimum of evidence necessary. because he didn't want to release anything private that didn't have to be released. And Leonard Sweat later said in a letter, I didn't even put my whole case in because it was so overwhelming to convict her. So, the jurors, as I said, it took them less than 10 minutes. So, that's why a lot of people think she was railroaded in. Actually, her trial was much more liberal, and she had much more rights than most people would have at that time. Yes? Oh, no, it's okay. No, yes?
That there was extended family that had the same diagnosis.
Mhm.
How far removed were those relatives?
Yes, Mary's relatives with mental illness. She had 18 siblings, I think 9 half and 9 whole. And some of her brothers were crazy. They were, her one, he was a medical doctor in the Confederate prison camp. He was just a sadistic murderer, really. But then some of her cousins, the Canfields, were her cousins. A whole bunch of them were committed. One killed herself, committed suicide. So it was clearly a Todd family trait. Mary's children, we don't really know about the 3 younger ones. Robert Lincoln, he suffered from a little bit of depression, but that did not start happening until after his son, Abraham Lincoln II, died in 1890. But other than that, Robert, he suffered anxiety, which Mary suffered, which also Mary's father suffered, very serious anxiety. But other than that, Robert actually didn't show any symptoms of that nature. So, yes, sir.
This mental asylum that she was sent to, how would that have ranked in quality compared to what the typical person would have had to face?
What was the typical quality of Bellevue Place versus what a common person would have done? Under the law, if you're found guilty of insanity, you go to the state asylum, which was like basically one flew over the cuckoo's nest. Dirty, disgusting, straitjackets, horrible place. But actually at that time, a lot of people were not committed. Their families didn't bring them there because it was so embarrassing. So at that time, a lot of people were locked in the basement. They were locked in the barn. I mean, it was horrible. The history of mental illness in America is a horrible thing to read. But Bellevue Place was a private sanitarium, one of the most respected hospitals in the Midwest. Dr. Patterson was one of the most respected mental illness doctors in the country. And it was basically, the building is still there. It's an apartment complex now. But it's not, it was like a bed and breakfast, really. It was gorgeous, beautiful, big rooms, big spacious. It was decorated like a home. Dr. Patterson, his family were all of his assistants, and they all lived in the main house, and the patients lived in the wings. Had, I think, 40 plus acres, gorgeous rose gardens, grass, trees, and Dr. Patterson practiced moral therapy, which was exercise, a good diet, a lot of bathing, a lot of rest, diverting the mind with, in that case, gardening. They would garden the rose gardens. The patients could walk anywhere, they could take carriage rides, they could go into town. He did absolutely no medication unless it was absolutely necessary. And he also did not take violent patients. He only took wealthy women of a certain status who were only mildly insane, I think the brochure says. They inhabit a borderland between this world and insanity. And so, there were reports that, Mary could hear the screams of the women immolating themselves, and that's not true. It was like a bed and breakfast. Mary had her own 2-room suite. She had her own nurse, which the other patients did not have. She took all of her meals with Dr. Patterson and his family, and she had perfect freedom to go wherever she wanted to, as long as she was accompanied by an attendant. So, yes, sir.
You're talking about her time in Washington. I'm working on reading Team of Rivals by Doris Goodwin.
Very good book.
And she makes innumerable comments in that book about Mary's appearances in Washington and how Washington people didn't like her and the conflicts that she went through. And yeah, she was a woman without a city, so to speak.
She was. And Doris did a great job in that book. I was a little scared how she was going to treat Mary in that book, in Team of Rivals. But I thought it was pretty spot on. It's a very good book. I have to admit I'm a little jealous of it. Yes, ma'am.
I have 3 questions. I've read in some places that it was thought that Mary was hypoglycemic or diabetic.
Mhm.
I have also wondered did they ever figure in the post-traumatic stress disorder? And as far as for family and family friends, what did Colonel Albert Ellsworth really think of Mary Lincoln?
Excellent questions. What did Colonel Elmer Ellsworth think of Mary Lincoln?
Yeah.
I have never seen anything, any letters or anything he wrote that he ever really had an opinion of her. There is a book on him, I actually haven't read it, but as far as did Mary have diabetes or post-traumatic stress? Doctors nowadays think possibly. There was an excellent article published in 1999 by 2 medical doctors who studied Mary's physiology, and that was their theory, was that Mary was suffering post-traumatic stress in 1875 because it was the 10-year anniversary of the assassination, and everywhere she looked, people were talking about the 10-year anniversary of the assassination, and she just couldn't handle it. And then a lot of doctors nowadays, and even back decades ago, think that Mary did die from untreated diabetes. She had, bed sores, she had swelling, she went blind, she actually could not barely walk, she could not walk downstairs. We don't know for sure, retroactive diagnosis is always difficult, including mental illness, I admit that. So it seems likely she may have died from diabetes. Post-traumatic stress, I don't know. It's certainly possible. Another theory too is that in 1875 she may have been going through menopause, which would have had a huge effect on her, which I've never found any evidence yes or no for that. So unfortunately I don't know, but yes.
The Elmer Ellsworth you're talking about, is that the same guy that took down the Confederate flag?
Yes, I'm sorry, yes, Elmer Ellsworth, very young guy, I think he was like 21, 22. And Abraham Lincoln almost thought of him as like a second son, and at the very beginning of the war there was a Confederate flag in Alexandria, Virginia, which you could see from the White House. And Ellsworth took his company of Zouaves. He was so angry, he charged into the hotel to tear down the flag, and the hotel manager came out with a double-barreled shotgun and blew him away. So, yes.
Going along with that, in Doris's, the Team of Rivals book, they mentioned that Confederate flag was actually presented to Mary. I don't know if that's completely
I can't believe that would be. I can't believe that would have happened.
If they allude to the flag.
Oh no, it was the American flag that Ellsworth was wrapped in. After, when he was,
Okay.
they killed the innkeeper, and then they wrapped Ellsworth's body in an American flag, and they carried him home in that, and that was given to Mary, yes. And then I believe she sent it to Ellsworth's parents, actually. Are we doing okay on time? Should I wrap it up or keep?
No.
Keep going? Keep going, all right. Yes, ma'am. Any Lincoln descendants? No. The last direct descendant died in 1985. His name was Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith. Basically, Robert Lincoln was the only son to survive. He had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. His son, Abraham Lincoln II, who they called him Jack, he died when he was 16 from blood poisoning, and when Robert was minister to Great Britain. Basically, the French doctors killed him. Robert's 2 daughters, his oldest daughter was Mary Lincoln, and she had 1 son. His name was Abraham Lincoln Isham, but they called him Link or Lincoln. Robert's youngest daughter, Jessie, she was the wild child. She eloped with a football player that Robert Lincoln despised. They had 2 children, Mary and Robert. The 3, yeah. There's a book published about the Lincoln women. It's called 4 Marys and a Jessie. It's actually a pretty good book. Of those 3 grandchildren, none of them ever had children. As far as we know, it was on purpose. All 3 of them hated being Lincolns. They felt like they were some kind of circus sideshow freaks. And they were also very private individuals, as was Robert. And they just didn't like the attention. And in fact, Peggy, Mary Todd Lincoln Beckwith, the granddaughter, they called her Peggy. She actually dedicated, in the 1960s, the nuclear submarine USS Abraham Lincoln. And it so impressed her that in her diary when she got home, she wrote, I don't remember the date, whatever the date was, she wrote, sunny AM, cloudy PM, broke bottle on boat, and so home to bed. She was very impressed by that. So none of them ever had children. So Bud Beckwith in 1985 was the last direct descendant. Yes, ma'am.
You have Carrie Ellsworth here, who's an ancestor.
Really? Fascinating. Yes, Ellsworth, it broke Abraham Lincoln's heart. He bawled like a little baby when Ellsworth died. And they gave him a state funeral in the White House. Yes, ma'am.
Wasn't it rather typical, in fact, even into the 40s, 1940s, when people were a lot of people were railroaded into mental hospitals because they were an embarrassment to their relatives? Like you said, all you had to have was a signature of a male.
Right.
Of a responsible, prominent male person, to get you into a mental hospital. Even in the 1940s, my uncle was in the Illinois State Asylum in Elgin. And my dad told me that there were a lot of people in there that they were just an embarrassment to their relatives. And I
Could
believe
be.
that.
Could be. There was also, I know that there's a great book, one of my main books was called The Mentally Ill in America by Deutsch, I think it was Albert Deutsch. It's a great book. And back in Mary's time, there was a lot of embarrassment. And the people who were embarrassed actually did not commit them. Those were the ones who locked them in basements and bedrooms. But I actually running this book, I read a lot of contemporary 19th century journals about insanity. Actually, it was called the Journal of American Insanity. Not a very PC title. But, and actually, when this Illinois law was passed, doctors were furious because they said, this is embarrassing. People are not going to bring their relatives forward for treatment because you're convicting them of a crime. You're taking them to court and saying you're guilty of insanity. But he also said, actually one thing he said was kind of the reverse of what you're saying, is that to bring them to court is humiliating for the family. So that's why instead they would either take them across state lines where they could just say, yes, she's crazy and lock her up, or they would be more likely to lock them in the basement because then you don't have to make it public. Yes? Yes, I toured the Talman House today. I thought the Talman House was fascinating. It was what a wonderful house. I did not know the story of Abraham Lincoln coming through here, and I just loved the story that he couldn't find his boots. And the guy who was sharing his bed got up because Lincoln was snoring so loudly and was so restless. I actually, when I called my wife earlier tonight, I actually had to tell her that story. I'm like, listen to this. She's like, yeah, okay. She's heard enough Lincoln, I think, the last lifetime. Yes, Joel.
Do you want to comment on the Janesville Cement Post Company?
Oh, sure, yes. I was telling Joel, and I'm actually the advisory historian for Hildene, Robert Lincoln's house, last year and this year. And so I'm actually writing a history of the house for the Friends of Hildene. And one thing I discovered was that in 1905, when Robert was building the house, Robert was actually, he was an amateur astronomer and an amateur surveyor. He actually surveyed the entire property, all the grounds, all the roads, all the fence work. And he ordered all of the fence posts for 490 acres of his land from the Janesville Cement Post Company. And so I discovered that this winter, so I have not yet been back there when there's no snow to look for the fence posts. But I plan to do that this summer. So yes, so there's another connection to the Lincoln. Yes? Yes, at the museum they have a cement post that Joel showed me. Now I know what to look for. Very interesting.
How and why did Robert Lincoln, wind up in Vermont living?
How did Robert wind up in Vermont? During the Civil War, excuse me, in 1863, Mary Lincoln, Manchester, Vermont, starting in the 1840s or 50s, was a very, very fashionable place to spend your summer. There was, the cool mountain air, there was white marble sidewalks, carriage rides, there was fishing, there was water, there was hiking. The Manchester, the Equinox House, gorgeous hotel. So Mary, being an avatar of fashion as she was, she went there because that's where people went. And Robert did not go with her then, but she went back in '64. Robert went with her then. And actually the entire family was supposed to go in '65, but the assassination, of course, prevented that. But that was Robert's first experience there. And then when Robert went into law in Chicago, his law partner, Edward S. Isham, was originally from Manchester. And he had a big summer house there. So Robert went there in the 1890s as a guest of Mr. Isham. And so Robert bought land starting in 1902. That was when, but before that, in the late 19th century, it was fashionable to go to Long Branch, New Jersey, or Colorado, or Georgia, to go places and visit. Starting at the turn of the century, it became fashionable to buy or build a summer home. And so at the turn of the century, Robert decided to buy and build in Manchester. And so yeah, so he moved in 1905, and actually he died in his house in Manchester in 1926. So, one last question. Yes, ma'am.
This is just kind of a fun question, I guess. So you find the letters.
Yes.
And you go to people, and you make copies.
Yes.
Who was the first person you called, and what was their reaction to you trying? I'm just trying to figure out, you know, how, really? No,
Right.
really? No.
Well, yes, you know, it was interesting. So at this point in my career, I had published, I think, 2 articles about Lincoln in Lincoln academic journals. But that was about it. I had been a park ranger, but nobody knew who I was. So when the news broke that I found these letters, well, at first people didn't believe it. Who's this guy who found these letters? And then, you know, back in the 30s or 40s, there were fake Anne Rutledge letters somebody claimed to have found. And then, of course, the fake Hitler diaries. So a lot of people thought I faked it until I showed them the letters. But then when they realized that it was real, then they all got mad. Who is this guy to find these letters? These are our letters. So, but you know what's really funny? If you go to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, they have a great program called the Ghosts of the Library. And they talk about archival documents, and I was sitting there a few months after I found the letters. And at the end of the program, the narrator says, "What about Mary Lincoln's missing insanity letters? Will anybody ever find them?" And I'm sitting there but you know what's really funny was that it's like the day before I found the letters, the Towers family had called the Lincoln Presidential Library to tell them that they had these letters, and they never returned their call. That's all right. My game. So, well, thank you all so much for coming. I would be happy to. I'd be happy to sign books if anybody wants to buy a book. I'll be sitting over there. Just answer more questions. As you can probably tell, I could talk all night about Mary, so I am happy to do it.